to the Hawke family, all those that knew Bob, all those in the Labor movement, not only within the Labor movement in Australia but across the world. But Bob was, through his actions and his deeds, a globally loved figure, because as Prime Minister of this country, he did not only impact on this country, impact on so many issues internationally. Other speakers have referred to his actions around Tiananmen Square, his fight, leading the fight in Chogam against the apartheid regime, and a whole range of economic and social and economic issues that he advocated effectively from the day he was born to the day that he passed. We all knew Bob wasn't well, and when Bob wasn't able to make the ALP national campaign launch in Brisbane, we knew he was very unwell, because if anyone who knew Bob would turn up to a Labor campaigning event, even if he was at his most sickest. And we knew that when he wasn't able to make the Brisbane launch, that things were not well, and that his time on this planet was finishing. And it's with great sadness that we heard the news on Thursday. And we were all hoping on this side that Bob would give his last great gift to the country, but it was not to be. Bob was an amazing character. He was a guy who could walk into a room with heads of state, with royalty, with significant players nationally and globally, and hold court. He could also walk into the front bar of any bar in this country and hold court and build the same rapport, the same relationship, and have the same respect with both rooms equally. That is a unique skill and a unique ability that this fellow had. Bob was no saint. He was a character. He loved to laugh, he loved a beer, but he was very, very serious about his work. He focused very much from early days, growing up, the values and the environment within which he grew up in really shaped his journey and shaped his value system and shaped his sharp intellect in terms of how he was going to live his life. A Rhodes Scholar, loved his sport. We all know how much he loved the sport, because on that great day that Australia won the America's Cup, he wore that ridiculous jacket, and so that anyone who sacks a worker for not turning up today is a bum. Now, for a Prime Minister to say those words and to get away with it is remarkable. But he loved his sport, he loved this country, and when those two things combined, he was in his element. He first came to the national stage as an advocate for the ACTU, and a passionate and fierce advocate. In fact, in the history of the ACTU, he was the movement's finest advocate. He argued the case for minimum wages. He argued the case for pay equity for women. He argued the case not just around wages policy in this country, but he argued and used all of his efforts at the ACTU to argue for consumers' rights in terms of competition in purchasing various goods that were only available to certain people, given our tariff circumstances. So Bob, even at the ACTU, he was a rock star in terms of the advocacy, and he could, on his feet. And I remember even after he retired as a parliamentarian, the ACTU brought him back to argue a case, to advocate a case for a rise in the minimum wage. And his arguments, his passion, his intellect was phenomenal. He had no peer in industrial tribunals around this country, and he held that position all the time. He was an advocate in the advocate role in the ACTU, and since then no one can hold a flame to the arguments and to the passion that Bob Hawke displayed in those forums and in those tribunals. He was a passionate advocate for equality and social justice, whether at the ACTU, whether in a whole range of community organisations that he played a role in, but advocating for fairness for the Australian people, a fair go for Australian people. Upon being elected to opposition leader, and the Honourable Premier has made reference to that short period of time, and we all would hope if that was the journey for all of us. But he was able to take on that role and to win that election in 1983, and from day one, Deputy Speaker, Bob Hawke led a team that changed the country for the better. And the beautiful thing about Bob Hawke's leadership was his ability to bring people together. His cabinet, a cabinet of equals. His cabinet of supremely talented people, all with various and individual ambitions, but he was able to harness all of the strengths of that cabinet to implement a range of reforms that this country is still feeling the benefit of. And the Leader of the Greens, Ms O'Connor, referred to the Accord. Now, the Accord was not just about a wages accord. This was a globally leading approach to economic management with fairness that no other country took that path. In the UK and in America, you saw Thatcherism and Reaganism, where a whole range of the liberalisation of the economy were being undertaken. But the difference with the Australian experiment, the Australian policy response led by Hawke and Keating and his cabinet, was to do it with fairness. So the implementation of the superannuation guarantee, so that workers were able to put some money away, and they forgo that in what they allowed that to pass through in exchange for a lack of wage increases. They allowed that superannuation commitment to be made, so that workers, by the time they reached their retirement, could retire with dignity. Retire with dignity. The modern superannuation system in this country, pension funds that they're referred to in other countries, is the envy of the world. Yeah. This was Hawke. This was Hawke. Floating the dollar, privatising assets, which was controversial at that time on the left, liberalising the economy, but doing it on the basis that he formed an accord, which is, has its people who disagree with it. But the accord laid the foundations for a modern economy, but with fairness. They didn't abandon working people and had minimum wages and minimum conditions. They had the universal healthcare system through Medicare. That's one of Bob's greatest legacies for this country. Yeah. And ensure the compulsory superannuation system, which has allowed workers, by the time they get to their retirement, to be able to retire with dignity. A whole range of reforms in the social welfare net, whilst combined with liberalisation. This was the most fair and comprehensive reform of any modern global economy. And you look at the social dislocation that occurred in the UK and the social dislocation that occurred in the US, and the winners and the losers, with more losers than winners. But in Australia, under Bob Hawke, Keating and his government, there were more winners than losers, Mr Deputy Speaker. And other speakers have referred to gender equality. He's global. He stood on the global stage in reforming and fighting against injustice wherever he saw it, particularly, as I referred to, in apartheid in South Africa. And Nelson Mandela himself acknowledged the role that Bob Hawke played in bringing down such an appalling racist regime in South Africa, the apartheid regime. Now, personally, my sister Michelle has referred to a couple of family stories where Bob, every time you saw Bob, he would always ask after the family. How's your mum? How's your dad? And my mum recalls the time she met him once on a campaign rally in the late 70s. I think it was around one of Whitlam's campaigns. And Bob saw her in a room in a large hall in Launceston. After many years, he walked up and said, "G'day, Colleen, how are you?" And for someone to be able, and that's not the only. You hear so many people say, "I met him once years ago, and he remembered my name." Bob had this great capacity to connect with people, to remember them and to ask after them. And I remember a time when I was an Economic Development Minister, and it was the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Madrid Protocol, which is the protocol which protected the Antarctic continent. Because at the time when Bob Hawke, and he tells the story that he was sitting on a Sunday afternoon at the lodge reading the cabinet papers, and a cabinet paper had come across his desk where effectively we'd signed up to an agreement to allow mineral exploration and other forms of exploitation of the Antarctic continent. And if it's very unparliamentary, but I'll quote Mr Hawke when he said, "They want to do what? Bullshit. We won't be doing that." And he led the charge, and I apologise for the language, and he led the charge to change that cabinet paper and to lead a global negotiation to sign off on the Madrid Protocol to ensure that the Antarctic continent was protected. And I was very fortunate enough to be at the celebration of the 30-year anniversary, where the then President of France, Michel Rocard, was in Hobart. And I remember a press conference down outside the Antarctic Division. We just had a number of speeches, and Bob and Michel Rocard was off the side smoking, as all Frenchmen do, and Bob was holding court with a large a gaggle of journalists asking various questions. There was one question that came forward. He said, Mr Hawke, where do you think the Antarctic will be in 10 years? And Bob said, well, probably the same place where it is now. So he had this ability to sort of take questions and have a sense of humour, but his passion passion for recognising things of global significance, and other members have spoken about his environmental record, Kakadu, the Great Barrier Reef, the Antarctic, the Franklin River, a whole range of really globally significant, historically significant decisions. But Bob was a larrikin. Every time you saw him, he was always up for a chat and ask how you were, ask how the family was. And for someone to lead the country 4 election victories for such a period of time, to be equally comfortable, I'm sure, at the Windsor Castle in London and sculling a beer near the Hill at the SCG cricket test, for someone to be able to do both of those and to be universally loved is a special human being. Again, condolences to his family and all that loved him, and because he was loved. He was loved by so many people, not only across Australia but across the world, and we are very sad for his passing. So, Bob, love your work, mate. You will be missed.
Yeah.
Honourable member for Clark.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's just been a joy to hear so many beautiful stories.